This week, we're going to continue our discussion about some of the market failures that we will encounter. In this chapter in particular, we look at the market failure that has to do with lack of competition. We'll look at how we can address this market failure. There's a little bit of history in this chapter. Because this is a market failure that we have dealt with for quite some time. But there's a couple of ways that we have used to try to address this particular market failure. And that is through the idea of an antitrust law or the idea of a regulation. So we recognize that sometimes businesses become very successful. And sometimes they use that power of their success in ways that we don't appreciate. And that's really what this chapter is going to be addressing. There's two main ways that we can address this particular market failure, and that's through an antitrust law or a regulation. So let's deal with antitrust laws first. And here's where a little bit of history comes in. In the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, we had the rise of several industry barons, extremely wealthy businessmen. They were men that dominated the economy, dominated politics, and they dominated the landscape. They rose in industries such as the railroad industry. They became very powerful in the oil industry, the mining industry, transportation, and the country eventually started to have some problems with the way these business people were using their power over the general population. So in order to determine what an antitrust law is, we first have to look at what a trust is. And so a trust is essentially a combination of firms or business people that place all their assets together, and it is controlled by what's known as a board of trustees. And that sounds like it might be a very good idea. Doesn't seem on the surface like there's anything wrong with that. The problem arises when the Board of Trustees allows the trust to engage in practices that are harmful to competitors. So, for example, one of those practices might be the idea of predatory pricing. For example, you get to be so big and so powerful that you can cut the costs, you can cut your prices for a short time, driving out the competition because maybe they can't keep up with your low prices. And then once the competition disappears, your prices rise again. And there's a variety of ways that businesses have figured out how to abuse the power that they might have over people. And so eventually in 1890, a law was passed. That law was called the Sherman Act. So the Sherman Act, by wording of the law itself, it outlawed any combination, trust, or conspiracy that restricted interstate trade. So notice it didn't outlaw trusts. It just outlawed those practices and those businesses that were restricting interstate trade. So this is trade that's occurring between the states. Problem was, it was hard to determine and hard to prove these cases. So for example, the law was passed in 1890. However, the Standard Oil Company, which is really the industry that they were going after at the time, a suit didn't actually make its way to the Supreme Court until I believe it was 1911. So it took a while to actually prove that they were restricting interstate trade. So along came another law that kind of provided some more clarification. And this is called the Clayton Act. And the Clayton Act actually spelled out some practices that if the business engages in these practices, they would be found guilty of violating the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, and there would be consequences. So, for example, you cannot have what's called a tying contract. For example, a company cannot make a sale to anybody, a sale based on tying another contract to that sale also. So, for example, Microsoft actually was found to be in violation of the Sherman Act because they had what was called a tying contract with the hardware manufacturers at the time. So the hardware manufacturers were producing these computers. The software manufacturers were producing the software that went on the computers. Microsoft essentially made some deals that with the hardware manufacturers that allowed the hardware manufacturers to preload Microsoft product. They preloaded the Internet Explorer, they preloaded Microsoft code, and what that meant was you could purchase a computer without anything preloaded on it, but then you would have to upload all the software yourself. Or you could buy a computer that was preloaded, but you just had Microsoft. Well, if you bought a computer that was already preloaded, you probably wouldn't go seek out competing products. You would just use what was already preloaded. So these were examples of tying contracts, and Microsoft was found guilty of that. They were told to cease that practice. You cannot, for example, have a business that has a board of directors in which some of the board of directors sit on the boards of other businesses. So, for example, somebody can't sit on the board of directors for Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola at the same time. They wouldn't allow that. So these were specific items, specific practices that if a business were to engage in these practices, they would be found in violation of the Sherman Act. They also created what was called the Federal Trade Commission, and the FTC is the entity that sort of monitors these business practices and looks at methods that are being used to limit competition. And so the FTC is the entity that sort of does the oversight of our interstate trade. So how do we interpret these laws? Here comes the challenge. If you remember your political science, Congress and the president create the laws, but the Justice Department interprets the laws. So interpreting the law is up to the Supreme Court. And before 1945, the Supreme Court used what was called the rule of reason. Essentially, that meant we'll know it's wrong when we see it. We can't identify it yet, but we'll know it's wrong when we see it. So being a monopoly isn't really necessarily wrong, but when you're a monopoly that's abusing your power, that's wrong. And we'll know it when we see it. So for example, U.S. Steel was found to be in violation of the Sherman Act because they were abusing their monopoly power. Another case that was brought forth in 1920 was U.S. Steel. So they weren't necessarily a monopoly, they were a large business, but they were a good business. And U.S. Steel, while it was a huge manufacturer of the steel in this country, it was found that it really wasn't doing anything in violation of any laws. Being big isn't really the problem. It's being big and abusing your power that's the problem. And the Supreme Court said, we'll know it when we see it. Well, in 1945, there was a case that was brought forth, and that switched the perspective. So the perspective under the per se rule essentially means being big is bad. Being a monopoly is wrong. And we don't really care what you're doing. It's that you're big. So for example, the Aluminum Company of America, this corporation essentially had a monopoly on the production of aluminum because they owned the bauxite mines that's used to mine bauxite, which goes into producing aluminum. They were found to be in violation of the Sherman Act because there was no competition. Being big was bad. And this is the per se rule. And the justice, the wheels of justice have kind of flowed back and forth between the rule of reason and the per se rule, kind of depending on the makeup of the courts and how they're going to interpret these laws. So one thing in particular that the FTC monitors has to do with mergers. And there's different kinds of mergers, and there's different cases that have been brought forward to illustrate these mergers. So a horizontal merger is a merger in which the businesses, they do exactly the same thing. They're competing with each other. And the case that brought this forth was the case of Vons Grocery Store, which was one of the major grocery store chains in Southern California. And they wanted to merge together with the number 2 grocery store chain in Southern California. And they were not allowed to do that because that would restrict competition so much. By having the top 2 grocery store chains merged together, essentially would reduce the choices that consumers would have for grocery shopping. So a horizontal merger is a merger in which the firms are doing the same thing. A vertical merger is essentially where the companies that are wanting to merge are companies that follow the production chain. So for example, at one time, Brown Shoe, if you're older, you may remember Buster Brown. Brown Shoe was the largest manufacturer of shoes in this country. And they wanted to merge together with Thom McAn, which was the largest retailer of shoes in this country at one time. So notice that's kind of up the chain of production. You have both from the producing the good to the selling of the good, and they wanted to merge together. That's a vertical merger. A vertical merger, for example, if General Tire wanted to merge together with Ford Motor Company, that wanted to merge together with Exxon Oil. That would probably be a merger that would not be allowed to happen. That would be a vertical merger. Now, sometimes these mergers are allowed because they don't really change the market any. Maybe it's rather insignificant, the mergers that are occurring. And we've seen an increase in cases of conglomerate mergers. So conglomerate mergers could be 2 completely separate kinds of businesses wanting to merge together. They have nothing in common. They don't do anything related to each other. Those often will go through. However, sometimes conglomerate mergers might be 2 businesses that there could be a connection between them. So for example, Walt Disney, the Walt Disney Company that we think of, Disney World, Disneyland, they merged together with ABC, the American Broadcasting Corporation. You might think at the time, they thought, well, pretty unrelated companies. You have theme parks and they produced movies, and you have a television studio. Not really much in common. But they have entertainment in common, and we can kind of see how that merger has played out through time, that there definitely is a relationship between Walt Disney and ABC. So the courts will examine these cases. They will try to make sure that there is competition, that we don't reduce our competition. They want to make sure that these companies are not abusing their power, which would be in violation of the Sherman Act. So another way that we can deal with this situation is the idea of just regulating these companies. And so regulations are created by the executive branch agencies, and they're not laws. Congress creates the law, but these are rules that businesses would have to follow. And a regulation might be designed to essentially have a business follow this rule so that the market outcome is actually different. So we started regulations back in the late 1800s, and the Interstate Commerce Commission was created to regulate interstate trade, interstate transportation, in particular the pricing that the railroads were using when they transported goods across state lines. So remember, in the late 1800s, we had the railroad barons. They dominated interstate trade. When things were traded back in the 1800s, they probably were transported through the railroad. So these railroad barons, these businessmen, they had immense power over the prices that people were going to pay, because they had power over the price of the transportation of those products. So the government came in and said, we're going to set the railroad prices. And they actually went even further and determined what routes the railroads would use and how many times a day they would use those routes. So the government set some regulations in place on the railroad industry. They increased and continued to increase regulations really until about the 1970s. Much of our economy somehow fell under some kind of regulation, either social regulation, those kind of rules that they really have nothing to do with the business or the economy as much as it has to do with maybe these other societal values that we might hold dear. So for example, it's a whole lot cheaper to produce a product if you don't have to worry about air pollution. If you could just put the stuff in the air and let it blow away. But we kind of like our clean air, so we created some regulations that have increased the cost of producing many items because now we can't have the air pollution like we once did. Economic regulation, these are regulations that affect actual prices and quantities of what is produced. So for example, the Federal Communications Commission, they're actually in charge of things like the airwaves that television stations would use to broadcast. And so they would be in charge of, for example, in Paducah, we have Channel 6 is our local station, but you could get other stations also that are located maybe in southern Illinois, if you get KFBS 12, but Paducah, it's WPSD. But in many of the larger cities, you have multiple local stations. I grew up in South Florida, and there were 4 local stations. So the FCC would make sure that those 4 local stations don't just join themselves together into one local station. That would reduce the type of news that would be delivered. And so you have entities that are handling economic regulation, but really you have a lot of regulation that really has to do with societal values. And these regulations really reached their peak in the 70s. And then towards the end of the 70s, we deregulated many industries. So for example, we got rid of regulations on the airline industry. At one point in our country, you had pretty much 4 airlines. You had Eastern Airlines, Northwest Airlines, Pan Am Airlines, Transamerica Airlines. Well, that was it. If you wanted to fly anywhere in 1970, it was going to be on one of those 4. But then they deregulated the airline industry. Do you have more choices now? Absolutely. And notice those Eastern Airlines doesn't exist anymore. So the idea of eliminating regulations may actually increase our competition and may allow for more competition by deregulating. The problem is, then they might be doing some practices that we don't like. And so maybe then we need to regulate them again. And actually the airline industry, for example, is still regulated. The FAA regulates the aircraft. They have to be inspected, and you have to have licensed pilots and all that sort of thing. You can't just go out and buy an airplane and start a company. You kind of do have to follow some rules, but there aren't any more rules like there used to be that directed prices and routes. So deregulation really reached its peak in the 80s. And then in the early 90s, we started to veer back again into a more regulatory environment. So in terms of regulations, we've kind of gone back and forth on that also. So how is it that we really determine that there's a lack of competition? We don't really just look at sales, we look at the competition. And the government uses this thing that's called a 4-firm concentration ratio. And that essentially says, of all the sales in this industry, what percent are held by the top 4 firms in that industry? And they try to kind of monitor that 4-firm concentration ratio. So for example, this is a completely made up industry here. The tire industry, we have these companies. So if you were to add up the total sales, it would add up to $432 million. The top 4 firms, if you just looked at the top 4 firms, they have $390 million. So of the $432 million, the top 4 own 90% of the sales. That's a pretty high concentration. There's very little competition in this example. So the higher the number, the lower the competition, the less competition you're going to have. So what if the number 1 firm, Sam, wanted to merge with the last firm, Fred? Well, all that changes is instead of 390 over 432, it's 392 over 432. It does reduce competition, not by a huge amount, but it definitely does reduce our level of competition. So the larger the number, the less competition there's going to be. So out there in the real world, looking at some of these concentration ratios, if you look at used car dealers, so this is not manufacturer, these are the dealers of used cars. So think of your used car lots. The top 4 used car dealers in this country only have 7%, 7.1% of all the used car sales in this country. Well, can you even name the top 4 used car dealers in this country? There's CarMax. There used to be a firm called Under 10,000. I'm not sure if they still exist. Yeah, that's about it. I have no idea who the top 4 used car dealers in this country are. Okay. However, if we go down to home centers, so if I give you the name of the first home center, you'll probably come up with another one very quickly. Lowe's. Home Depot's number 2. So Lowe's, Home Depot, actually Menards, I believe, is number 3 or 4. But you notice these are companies, they hold 91% of all the sales at that type of store. It's pretty much Lowe's, Home Depot, Menards, I think Ace Hardware. That's it. Now you have lots of other little mom and pop hardware store kind of places, or places you could buy a 2x4, but pretty much people go to Lowe's, Home Depot, and Menards. And so we'll look at these ratios, and if a merger is proposed that significantly reduces these ratios, the government tends not to let them go through. So a couple of cases in particular that the government does want to monitor are the idea of a natural monopoly. So remember, a natural monopoly exists when it's simply cheaper for one firm to supply the market than it is to have multiple firms. So we've talked before about natural monopolies. The water company is an excellent example. If you were to have competing water companies, they'd all have to dig up the road and lay their own pipe to deliver water to people, and that doesn't make any sense. So the way that we really think about natural monopolies, we look at what their demand is, and there's a couple of ways that we can kind of address the issue. They do behave as a monopoly, so there's a downward sloping demand and the marginal revenue is less. What's unique about natural monopolies is that the minimum of the long run average cost has not yet been met in the range of where the demand for that product is. So where the demand for the product is, there's still economies of scale. And so there we have a natural monopoly. So if we were to completely leave this market alone, let it be a monopoly, and let it do what it does as a monopoly, it would choose marginal revenue equals marginal cost, so 4 units, and it would price off the demand curve, price of $25. That would simply be the price that it charges. We might say that's too high. So the government may come in and they may require the firm to set their price at the efficient market price. If there were competition, the price would be $10. Okay, but notice, if the government forces this natural monopoly to charge $10, how is this firm going to do? Are they going to be making profit? Are they going to be making losses? Are they going to be making normal profit? How are they going to do? So at $10, notice the cost of producing 7 units is more than $10. So this is a firm that actually would be losing money. So if we're going to charge off of the marginal cost curve, this is called marginal cost pricing, if we're going to force them to pay this efficient price, the government's going to end up having to subsidize this industry, because otherwise they would go under. We can also allow the firm to make a fair profit. So remember, normal profit is when your economic profits are 0. We could allow them to charge a higher price, just not $25. Allow them to charge $15 and earn a fair profit, normal profit. And we can let them go at that. And then no subsidy would be needed. So really what we can do, we can have marginal cost pricing, but the firm is going to lose unless there's some kind of government subsidy. We can allow them to earn normal profit, or we can allow them to earn as much profit as possible. Charge that $25, make your profit, but we can then require them to share that profit back to the customer. And interestingly, in this area, we actually have examples of that third alternative. Many of us in rural areas have our phone service landline phone service delivered through what's called a telephone cooperative. These are essentially businesses. The government has said you all can maximize your profit, but what profits you generate have to go back to your telephone customers. And so, for example, if you're a customer of Ballard Rural Telephone Cooperative, every year you get a credit on your, I don't know which month it is, but they will issue a credit to your account, which is essentially a return of the profits. It's a little piece of the profits. So they want the firm to be profitable, but they have to share the profits. So out of this chapter, you should have seen just some basic information about an antitrust laws. We discussed a little bit of the cases. We looked at how the courts interpret those laws and how they look at mergers and different kinds of mergers. And then we examined the idea of regulation and deregulation and the trends that have been following in that. And then we concluded by looking at how we regulate natural monopolies by either letting them earn a profit and then sharing the profit, or maybe we let them earn a normal profit, or maybe we require them to charge based off of marginal cost and we subsidize them. So these are some of the ways that the government gets involved in a particular market failure. We also will deal with regulations in the next chapter when we deal with the market failure of externalities.